This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. This is your host, Jess Root, from CardsWire.com, the USA Today Arizona Cardinals site on our NFL Wire. My co-host is Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com and SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site. And we're back from the holiday weekend. We're recording pre New Year's, so this is not the off-season show, but it is it's the end of season show. Seth, we are finally here. The season is done. The Cardinals have wrapped up their year. They're not in the playoffs. They lose to the Los Angeles Rams 31-24. First of all, Seth, how was the holiday? How was Christmas for you guys?
It was good. I mean, lots of family, lots of fun. Kids were spoiled as usual. So, I mean, it was good, man. And then we had a family Christmas party yesterday and watched the entirety of the Cardinals game where I tried not to lose my mind. So, we'll kind of see how this all plays out and kind of enjoy the not having to deal with the Cardinals on Sundays, but we're also, I think, looking forward to kind of how they're going to figure out this issue that they're dealing with.
Well, it's interesting because we've gone so long. We've been experiencing since 2010, ever since Kurt Warner retired, is quarterback of the future, quarterback of the future, quarterback of the future. And they got Carson Palmer. That worked out really well. Quarterback of the future, but even after about 2 years in, it's like, well, who's going to follow him? Who's going to follow him? But now we've got that. The quarterback situation is set. The coaching situation looks set, and there appears to be a base, a kind of a core that we can count on. But this isn't technically the off-season show. This is the end of season show. We're going to go into the off-season. We will talk about off-season needs. We'll talk about plans moving forward. But in this episode, this edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, episode 254, we're going to look back at that Cardinals loss. They finished 5-10-1. In the end, they won pretty much the amount of games that we wanted to see. If you recall, as we looked at the middle of November, we looked at the schedule and said, we'll be disappointed if they don't get to 5 wins. And then they lost 6 games in a row, but they end up with 5 wins. At the end of the year, you feel pretty all right with how things went. It was streaky. And in week 17, they lose the LA Rams 31-24. And so what we've got in this episode of the show, we're going to look back at the game, the good and the bad from that game as they lose to the Rams in the season finale. We're going to talk about some of the beginning of the offseason, because we found out on Monday that, well, one, Steve Keim is staying because nothing has been said at all. Vance Joseph is staying. Cliff Kingsbury said that was never really an option. And there are some coaching changes that have been reported. And then we're going to go into we're going to do our awards. This will be the end of the season award show. Who are the players that get awarded? Who are we going to recognize for our MVP? Some of these will be obvious, but who's the most improved, the biggest surprises, the best non-rookie addition, things like that, biggest disappointment. So that's coming up in this edition of the show. Seth, let's go ahead and get started. What for you were the good things that you saw in the loss on Sunday?
I think the good things continue to be the growth on offense that we've seen from this team. We talked about it after that embarrassing loss a couple weeks ago. The Cardinals had scored less points over the last 5 games against the Rams than the Rams actually averaged per game against the Cardinals. So even though the Cardinals still lost, and now they're, at 6 losses in a row to the Rams. They scored 24 points. They had scored 31, I believe, or 32. 32 the previous 5 games. So they were at 45% of their total points in the previous 5 games in this one game. That's improvement. I mean, it sucks to try to find that as a good thing, but when you're looking at it and when you're just being honest with yourself, those are the small victories you have to take when you're a 5-win team.
It's true. I mean, offensively, although I will say this game felt like it was on the edge of getting out of control for almost the entire game.
Yeah, it felt like the Rams were one possession away from just blowing it open, and the Cardinals were one possession away from getting blown out. And so I think that was good to see them keep it close and have a chance. I mean, although it was a really bad chance, have a chance at the end.
Well, it's true. And that's the part the good part is they were in that game. It didn't feel like they were in that game. And they turned the ball over 5 times. That last turnover. I hate to even consider that last one a turnover. They had 4 real turnovers, and they didn't play. There were some good and bad things on defense that they did, but at the end, the entire game they were still in it. They fell behind early. They battled back. They kept themselves in the game, and it felt like things were going to get out of control and they were going to get blown out. But they held on, even with the mistakes that they made. They still managed to keep. And that, if there's one thing that we got to enjoy, even in the losses, is the fact that the Cardinals, with the exception of 3 games, were really in it. They were embarrassed against the Rams at the beginning of December. The Carolina and the Seattle game early in the year got out of hand. But pretty much every game thereafter, the fight was there and things never got out of hand. Even though things looked bad, they still clawed their way back in the game. And I think that's really important moving forward. I think it's one of the things that you had to impress you the most is after the number of blowouts. That when Michael Bidwill, after 1 game into the 2018 season, was already regretting what they did with the coaching staff to take a guy who was a college coach with a losing record, and Cliff kind of referred to that. The guys played for him. He really did a good job of approaching his job in a way that drew the respect and the effort out of his players. He kept them fired up. He protected them. He showed that he didn't BS them. It's kind of the thing is that Larry Fitzgerald's comment about it is that he didn't try to BS you. If he didn't know, he said, I'll get back to you on that. And he wouldn't just try to tell you something to tell you something. As Cliff Kingsbury continued to impress me. But that wasn't, one of the things I kind of liked, one of the good, is they were able to stay in the game early and get back into the game early without the aid of their running game. And then they were able to add the running game late. And so while they were one-dimensional, they turned it around at the end and didn't get things out of control.
Yeah, and that's the thing that you've seen, and you and I have talked about quite a bit with Cliff this year, is it's been really interesting to see him adapt his offense and maybe his preferences on how he wants to coach and what he wants to do. And so to see him change the offense to a more ground-based game, but then still have the adaptability and wherewithal when his franchise quarterback's hurt, he's not going to run as much. And to see him kind of change again the offense to the point where they're throwing the ball more, and all of a sudden they're having, that same type of success. I think it's I just think it's interesting that you continue to see an evolution of Gary, the play caller, and he's not just this kind of one-trick pony that maybe we had expected to see from him. And to be this stubborn, and I mean, I think part of that is we saw it with Chip Kelly, right? Like that was the whole thing. Is you saw, oh, this is a guy who thinks he's smarter than the NFL and he's gonna do what he wants to do and blah blah blah, and you watch him, and you watch Cliff, and he's kind of the complete opposite of that, and to see him, be that type of coach and be multiple and be a guy that's willing to change up what he desires to do for what's best for his team. I thought that was pretty cool.
Now the whole Cliff thing. One of the things that I think is very kind of the undersold thing here is people knocked the Cardinals for hiring Kingsbury because as exciting a hire as it was, the fact that he wasn't one of those top coaches, I think, really was a benefit because he didn't come in and he was real self-aware. I was like, I don't have that kind of juice. Like Chip Kelly came in, decorated. Nick Saban's came in, decorated. Steve Spurrier. Every college coach that's ever come across is highly decorated, been highly successful, and so they have a way they want to do it. I don't know if I put it on social media, but I think I have. The Dallas Cowboys, they waited a year too long. I mean, they haven't technically fired Jason Garrett yet. Cliff Kingsbury would have been the perfect coach for that situation because, one, he has the mind for the NFL today, and two, he doesn't come in. He came in and leaned heavily on Steve Keim. That's the guy that Jerry Jones would love. A guy who can do football well and will take the counsel and will be, in a way, kind of a yes man. If Jerry Jones goes out, and I know this is a Cardinals show, but Jerry Jones, if he's going to go out and get Lincoln Riley or get Urban Meyer, those guys are going to come in and just like with Jimmy Johnson a couple of decades ago, they're going to butt heads because they're going to want to do it their way. They're not going to want to just let Jerry do his thing. Cliff would have given his input and would have let Jerry get him the players that he needs, and he would have adapted. Dallas really kind of messed up, and I think the fact that he's he had the mind, but the fact that he wasn't a successful head coach in terms of wins and losses really helps him with his adaptability. And everyone talks about this air raid and this. Now, I get it. He did, you look at his last couple of years at Texas Tech, it was all receivers. But if you look at his history, the truth is we shouldn't be surprised at his flexibility. He even cited 2012 when he was at Texas A&M. They led the SEC in rushing. He had DeAndre Washington had 1,000 yards rushing 2 consecutive years. That was the first time that had been done at Texas Tech since the mid-90s. He's done it with running. He had Jason Morrow in 2013, 106 receptions at tight end. So this is a guy, obviously his scheme, the analytics say throw the ball, receivers, but he's not dumb. When he saw what was working, he wants to win football games. He wants to be successful offensively. And so now you had a running back tight end. You had a running back and tight end driven offense. And well, let's look at this. Some things to look forward to. Like Dan Arnold looks like a great guy looking forward. I know it's just a kind of a game and a play. We fall in love with guys like Ricky Seals-Jones, but Dan Arnold looks like there's something there kind of moving forward to be a dynamic playmaker. Max Williams has done his thing. He's getting good contributions from guys you didn't expect. Kind of think back. We've gotten the production out of Larry Fitzgerald. Christian Kirk didn't have the big year that a lot of people hope. But let's kind of look at some of the big producers we've gotten. We've had big games from Chase Edmonds. Kenyon Drake came on and became a stud. Damiere Byrd has had big games. Dan Arnold, Max Williams. We are not getting production from expected sources, And that's what we saw on Sunday as well. Max Williams had a 23-yard catch. Demir Byrd had 74 receiving yards. He had a touchdown. Dan Arnold had 4 catches for 76 yards. Christian Kirk could have done more. They're getting production from a lot of different places. And Kenyon Drake didn't have a dynamic game, but still by the end of the game, he averaged 5 yards a carry.
Yeah, and when you look at it, it's, again, a mishmash. I mean, what was the talk coming into this year? How bad the offensive line was going to be. Oh, you kept perpetually injured DJ Humphries and Justin Pugh. You're rolling out 33-year-old AQ Shipley coming off ACL. Oh, I can't believe you're not starting Mason Cole and you're going with AQ Shipley. You signed J.R. Sweezy. He sucks. He can't even – the Seahawks don't even want him back. Who's Justin Murray? Who is this?
He's been cut by 6 teams.
And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is the second best rushing offense by DVOA in the NFL. Kenyon Drake was the 5th best running back in the NFL by DVOA or DYAR, and 3rd best by DVOA. Like, those are insane numbers. Those are analytics-based numbers that take into account talent talent of the opposition, talent of the primary team. And so you see all that and you go, wait, are we talking about the same team? The Arizona Cardinals have the best rushing offense in the NFL after the Baltimore Ravens? No. I mean, this was going to be the air raid. This was they drafted 3 wide receivers
from David Johnson on top of that.
Right. And so that's the thing is, like, I just and everybody, oh, well, it's all Kyler Murray. Well, I mean, yeah, Kyler Murray is a large part of why the rushing offense was so good.
But it's not, I mean,
but it wasn't
540 yards.
Right. And so here's the thing. Am I going to sit here and say that my desire for this team is to not, make any changes on the offensive line? Absolutely not. But I don't think you can understate how much better they were than what we all expected, especially when Marcus Gilbert went down. Here it comes, right? Here comes the cavalcade of injuries.
And that was it. They had 4 guys on the offensive line make 16 starts and played almost every snap. In fact, in terms of snaps lost to injury, I think it's under 10. If I look at it. DJ Humphries came out for a couple plays. Sweezy came out for a couple plays. Pugh came out for a couple plays. But like late in the year, they're just putting Mason Cole in the game to play Mason Cole.
As an extra blocker. Yeah. And so that's
they're just getting, okay, we're gonna give Pugh 5 plays off here. We're gonna give Sweezy here 3 plays off. Like, he's getting 20 snaps a game just because.
So, I mean, you just look at it. I think you have to be super impressed with what he did and who he was and how he changed. And I think you hit it on the head. It's does Cliff Kingsbury know that he's an incredibly intelligent play designer and play caller? Yeah, I mean, when USC, the LA Rams, and the New England Patriots are all pursuing you to be, part of their offensive kind of room, that says a lot. And I think, as you said, having the lack of ego, or more importantly, the wherewithal and the understanding of who you are as a coach to say, no, this isn't my strong suit. I'm going to defer to Steve Keim. I'm going to defer to Vance Joseph. Now, if this is the end of year 3 and we're still talking about the same issues on defense or in other places, that's a different story. But this is year 1. This is the first time that Cliff Kingsbury's coached in the NFL. As Jess has said, as everybody knows, he was a losing coach in college football. So it was about him establishing a brand. And I'll tell you this, and this is, kind of from Jess and I talk about this stuff. I don't write about it. I don't, I'll talk about it in passing on the show, but I can tell you this: people enjoyed playing for the Cardinals this year. People are intrigued about playing for the Cardinals under Cliff Kingsbury because he is a guy that treats you like a man, but also gives you the freedom to be a guy, to be yourself, that allows you to. They put the onus on you as, hey, this is your job. Do kind of that New England Patriots, do your job. Like, understand that this is a job. Like, if you want to get better, you have to do your job. When you're having to tell Kyler Murray, you can't be here, it's the bye week, go away, type stuff like that. Like, that's what Cliff wants. He wants to have to be kind of the guy that goes, hey, no, you guys need to go. I appreciate that you're so involved and want to be here so bad, but you guys need to get away every once in a while too. And so that's the thing is, I mean, Christmas Day, giving the guys the day off, that meant a lot to the team. Not everybody does that. Did he make some mistakes along the way? Absolutely. I mean, he probably looks at the extra time off on the bye week and goes, bad idea. But he's also a first-year head coach. He wants the guys to want to play for him. And you have different ways of going about that. You can be a guy like Cliff Kingsbury who kills everybody with kindness and gets guys to buy in and want to be a part of something like that. Or you can be a guy like Brian Flores who, was successful in his own right in Miami this year, and a guy you and I were very high on in the Steve Wilkes year. You and I both loved the idea of Brian Flores. And he did it the opposite way. This is how we're going to do things. If you don't want to be in part of it, get the hell out. So there are two sides of the same coin that are getting to the same direction. It doesn't mean either one's right or wrong, but I think you would say for what we were coming into this year expectation-wise, that you saw the success and growth that you wanted to see, and that is good enough going into year two.
Come to the next episode of the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We're going to move on. We kind of drew away from the actual game, but we're going to come back and talk about the disappointments of that. What were the things we didn't like? What were the disappointing parts of the loss to the Rams? That's coming next from Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. There were, obviously, with the loss, there were plenty of things we could pick at. And for me, and it wasn't even because it was a bad game by Chandler Jones, but what a disappointment to end the year the way that Chandler Jones did. He had an impactful game. He knocked down 2 passes. He had a tackle for loss. He had a QB hit. But the Rams completely took him out. Their game plan was, don't let Chandler Jones get anything. This is, the storyline leading up to Sunday's game could he break Michael Strahan's record? That would mean a third 4-sack game. Basically, we pencil in Chandler Jones with a sack every game, so 20 sacks was going to be an inevitability, and if he did, and he was going to win the sack title. After the end of that game, he came away with nothing. No sacks. He didn't break the record. He didn't get to 20. He didn't even win the sack title because Shaquille Barrett over in Tampa Bay picked up 3 sacks in the finale and finished with 19 and a half. It wasn't a disappointment in the fact he played poorly, but it was disappointing that he couldn't get at least 1 sack, that he was complete. He was basically taken out of the game and even still managed to have an impact. That said, the great ones still manage to get home sometimes. And I get that for some reason the Rams have really focused on Chandler Jones because in the last 2 years, in 4 games, Chandler has half a sack. And that half a sack came in the first game in December. And I would even say he probably shouldn't have even gotten that sack. I thought that sack was deserved to be split between Cassius Marsh and I think it was Jonathan Bullard at the time.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that's the thing is that's a tough game for him in general. He's got, this added pressure of trying to win a sack title. He's the focal point of every defense when he walks in. I mean, we know that. And so it's and then he, like you said, he didn't disappoint at all, but it was disappointing in the fact that he was not able to kind of finish the season in the way that fans had hoped he would. So, I mean, that's always the toughest part is to go, from there and go into the off season thinking, hey, was there one more thing I could have done? And Chandler does that enough for himself, so he doesn't need us to do it. I mean, that's the truth with him is he's a guy that, I mean, think about it. He's basically gotten better every single year he's been with the Arizona Cardinals. And so at this point, it comes down to, is this going to be a continuation? Like, is he a guy that's going to continue to grow as a player? And I think it's safe to say yes. And now the question really becomes, is it time to extend his contract and even, give him a little more in terms of what he has earned as a player.
That would be an interesting thing to talk about as we hit the off season. For you, what else was disappointing in the loss to the Rams?
I don't want to say I'm disappointed because it's hard to be disappointed in only seeing something for 3 weeks, but I think you and I were both disappointed that there was not a stronger performance by the defense in their finale. They had come off 3 games where you really felt like they were putting it all together, that it was kind of coming all together, and you were looking at a team that had turned that corner finally defensively. This was something that was brought up to me and I didn't even know. You may have known, or we probably both knew, but we just never really thought about it. But did you know they had 0 defensive or special teams like touchdowns this year?
Ooh. Yeah, that makes sense. That's not
and
great.
So that's what it is. Like, you look at it and you go, oh yeah, I knew that. And then you're like, holy crap, they didn't score at all. And so you look at all these like crazy, all these just crazy offensive growth. And I think they scored like 120 more points or something crazy like that. And all this stuff. And they did it all on offense. I mean, they didn't score on defense at all. And so when you look at it from that perspective, you're like, holy crap. Like, that's not a great statistic to have to look at. So, I think that in the final game I know it wasn't reverting back and I know it wasn't that bad, but like to revert back to being that just bad, porous kind of defense, it sucks to see that be how this season ends after 3 weeks where you're like, this defense is doing enough for the offense to win games. They won 2 of them, they lost 1, and I feel comfortable pinning that on the offense. And so you kind of look at it from that direction, and that's the tough thing.
And defensively, especially early in the game, the defense didn't play well. I mean, didn't play poorly, except on third down. They
and it was that
really,
it was
really.
that,
I mean, they were really good against the run early in the game, but they couldn't get off the field on third down. The Rams went 11 for 18, and honestly, were it not that the Rams really kept the Cardinals in the game with that inexplicable fake punt inside their own 20. Because and then they missed a field goal. That kept the Cardinals in the game, and then they kind of got off track. But then defensively, they just they couldn't. They did some nice things because Patrick Peterson made some plays. Chris Jones made a couple of plays. Byron Murphy made a couple of plays. But they still struggle. Like Byron Murphy struggled. He made some plays, but he still got beat a lot. Cooper Kupp ate him for lunch. Tyler Higbee was a problem. Todd Gurley got going in. Well, it wasn't even Todd Gurley. It ended up being Malcolm Brown. It was the change of pace back that as the game went on, their rush defense faded. So they did some good things offensively, and it looked like they were playing better. But at the end of the game, you're looking at, they gave up over 400 yards. Jared Goff had 3 touchdowns. They convert on 61% of their third downs, and they scored over 30 points again against the Cardinals. That's 6 straight games.
Yeah, and that's just, I mean, it's frustrating to see the defense fall to the depths that they've fallen to. Because I feel like in the first couple of years you saw the growth of this team, and you saw talent coming in even when talent was going out, if that makes sense. And then all of a sudden, since about 16, it's like been a steady decline until it bottomed out this year. I mean, we saw that on offense last year, but it's frustrating to see that. I mean, they gave up 17 more points than last year. Holy cow, they scored 136 more points this year. And again, all those points were on offense. There was none on defense. So it was one of those situations where you just kind of you just wish to see the continued growth. I mean, if they are able to kind of hold the Rams down under 25 points, you basically are on par with what you did last year on defense. And to see them, struggle again. I mean, they gave up over 30 points in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 games. So, I mean, they gave up 4 touchdowns in half their games. In 8 games, they gave up 4 touchdowns. They gave up over 24 points in 11 games, and they gave up over 20 points in 15 of 16. So, I mean, that's just not good. And so that's I think the biggest takeaway and struggle from this year.
As we look for, obviously, I think for me, Kyler Murray, he showed something in the fact that he played and he wasn't 100%. And he took the running out of his game, and he did play well, but oh my gosh, the turnovers. And he gets credit with 4 turnovers. He had 2 more interceptions. The first interception, it wasn't a bad throw. It was a great play to tip the ball. In fact, if the ball doesn't get tipped, Fitz probably gets a catch. But the second interception, that was bad. He throws a good ball, and Fitz might score a touchdown. Instead, it's a turnover. And then he loses 2 fumbles, even though those two fumbles are... I mean, you can't blame it on him because Kenyon Drake just dropped the toss, and then A.Q. Shipley snapped the ball too early, so Murray wasn't ready for it. That said, you can't turn the ball over four times and expect to win a ball game, especially against a team that you've not beaten in 3 years.
Yeah, and that's the thing is one of the things we've talked about with Murray so much is how well he's taking care of the ball. So to see it kind of go the other way and this game be an issue, but we've seen that. I mean, in two of their losses, a lot of it was on Murray, the Steelers, and in this Rams game. And like you said, the 5 turnovers was kind of, that's false for the most part. But when you're a team that struggles on defense to get stops in general, you can't give your defense, extra, or you can't give the opposing offense extra possessions. That's an issue. So I just, it was one of those situations where I think they continued to struggle to find consistency in those things. And that's part of the thing when you have a rookie quarterback. I mean, they're apt to making turnovers. And so to see only, 14 total turnovers for Kyler this year to 24 touchdowns. I mean, that's not, I think you would expect worse for a rookie quarterback, especially with all the issues they've had this year.
Right. And especially when you look across, Jameis Winston joins the 30-30 club. 30 touchdowns, 30 interceptions. That's really insane. That said, coming up next on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's talk a little bit about the fact that Vance Joseph is back. What are our reactions? What are our thoughts? And was it the right move? That's coming up next on Rise Up Sea Red. We're back on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Vance Joseph, he gets to stay. Cliff Kingsbury said Vance will be back. He said he never wavered. He talked about continuity. He talked about how they played in the last month of the season. He talked about liking the way Vance Joseph approached things. He liked the scheme. He liked the way he did things. Were you surprised? I mean, first of all, I wasn't surprised. As bad as things went this season, I actually never really thought. I thought for sure Vance Joseph was going to get a second year no matter what. Were you surprised in the end that Vance Joseph stayed?
No, I mean, you and I talked about it earlier. It basically came down to they had to figure out what Joseph could do with the guys that he was expecting to have. And you look at, this season, it's been kind of a cluster of injuries. You had obviously Robert Alford and Darius Fallon, the two big veteran free agent acquisitions. Neither one played a single snap in the regular season. DJ Swearinger apparently forgot how to play football. Terrell Suggs forgot after 4 games how to play football. And then you've had the Patrick Peterson suspension and then apparently 6-week hiatus to get back into football shape during the season. I mean, you look at the defensive line in general, you had what? Obviously, we talked about Fallon. Zach Allen got hurt. You had
Jonathan Buller got hurt.
Jonathan Buller
was a moron. Clinton McDonald got hurt.
Yeah, Rodney Gunter got hurt. I mean, literally by the end of the season, it's Corey Peters and a bunch of guys that weren't even on the roster. Oh, and a 7th-round pick in Michael Dogby. So, I mean, that's the thing is all of that. Can you put some of that on the GM? Yes. Some of it, though. Like, I wouldn't put all of it on there. I think the linebacking position issues on the GM. The fluke stuff with the corners and defensive line, I mean, if you want to put it on the GM in the essence of, like, preparedness type stuff and looking into the 5-year plan as opposed to the, 5-minute plan. Okay, I'll give you that. But, and nobody's a bigger critic of Steve Keim than I am. But, I mean, you can't predict that Robert Alford is going to get hurt and not play. You can't predict Darius Fallon is going to try to shoot a stripper. You can't predict, you're then number 3, 4, 5, and 6 defensive linemen get hurt. Like, you can't predict all of that. So you want to blame him for Hassan Reddick? Go for it. You want to blame him for other things? So, you just look at those things. I think
he produced the only Pro Bowlers the Cardinals have.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing is, I do think, and my guy Walter Mitchell wrote I thought a really interesting article about it. It seemed like there was maybe some disconnect. Maybe that's the best way to put it for between Keim and Vance Joseph on what was expected. And I think that's a interesting situation to kind of follow along with in and of itself. It's because, playing Terrell Suggs, doing those type of things, all of that is, all that's tough. And so when you look at it from that perspective, I just think, yeah, it becomes this difficult situation where you're just, did he put the team in the best position all the time? No. And I don't think anybody, you talked about it today. Those freaking zones on 3rd and long, like, it's just so infuriating. But at the same time, it is what it is. And you can only deal with what you're handed. And he was clearly handed kind of garbage.
He was. Now, the question is this. Was keeping him the right move? I'm going to say, I don't know if he was the right hire originally, and I don't know if it'll work out. But you can't keep flipping defensive coordinators. They went from James Bettcher to Al Holcomb to Vance Joseph to then change again would be setting up Cliff Kingsbury for failure, because they had a bad defense last year. They had a bad defense this year, although this defense improved late in the season. So for me, this was absolutely the right move to do. You cannot expect, even though Vance Joseph talked about having a top 10 defense again, like they used to have, but you can't have one of the worst defenses in the league, give them a new defensive scheme and expect them to be significantly better. Now, there were some things that were very frustrating, but we know why. When Patrick Peterson gets suspended and they lose as many players that did injury and they're playing that many rookies, it is unquestionably the right move to make, unless, and there would be one scenario in which I would have said it's okay to let Vance Joseph go, and that was if you can get Wade Phillips. And that's about it, because you'd be running essentially the same defensive scheme with a guy who's had much more success as a defensive coordinator, and period. And Wade Phillips doesn't have a contract after the year with the Rams, but I think the scenario is it's a decision whether he's going to coach still for the Rams or whether he's going to retire. I don't think he's probably going to be that type of free agent moving forward, but that would have been the one exception. If you can go get Wade Phillips and run essentially the same defense with a guy who does it better, okay, then you move on. Otherwise, this is the right move to make.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, we talked about this during the season, what coaches were going to get fired that kind of check the boxes. Now, if you want to talk about getting out of this idea that you have to be a 34 team, that's a different story. But I mean, a 34 defensive coordinator that has head coaching experience, so you can't really, you don't have a ton of choices, so you just have to do what's best for your team. And at times too, I'm really big on continuity and continuation, and I think the voice especially for like a guy like Hassan Reddick. Think about it. I mean, it went from James Betcher to Steve Wilkes to Vance Joseph. So you really want to bring in somebody else again. I mean, we'll see what happens, but I don't think it's a game changer. I think if they go 7-9 next year and they're still in the 25 or below, so they're still a bottom 8 defense in the NFL, then we can have this conversation. And they don't have a cacophony of just injuries again. then we'll have this conversation. But if Vance gets guys, Robert Alford's back, you get a couple defensive linemen and linebackers in free agency, and all of a sudden you're a little more competitive. Then it's on Vance at that point.
And that makes perfect sense. You give him a chance to build on a second year. Yeah, it just makes sense that way. Now, was he the right move to begin with? I'm for the most part, I'm going to say this. In terms of coordinators out there in the NFL, it takes the right situation between coordinator, talent, and head coach. I don't know if there are many defensive coordinators. There might be one or two defensive coordinators out there that are game changers in terms of whether your team is bad and whether your team is great. And so continuity really comes into it because most of the defenses are fairly similar. Vance Joseph, admitted he runs a Wade Phillips defense. There's lots of teams running Wade Phillips defenses out there. Wade Phillips has a really good defense. He's traditionally, except for this year, I think it was 21 straight years that he's been a coordinator, that his teams are playoff teams. When he's a coordinator, that's something. And so there's pretty much, and I think this on most head coaches as well, there are probably 2 to 5 guys that are franchise changers, that are truly difference makers at the positions, and everything else is a matter of circumstance and decision making. And so it doesn't matter if you brought in another coordinator unless he's a game-changing coordinator. Vance Joseph is a good enough coordinator to lead a winning team in the right situation. It's just a matter of whether this situation is the right situation.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. And the other thing is this, when you get it, I mean, outside of like Vic Fangio, how many of those guys hang around now? That's kind of my whole thing, is that, I mean, it's a good problem to have too, but unless you have a Baltimore Raven or New England Patriot type situation, like, it comes and goes in waves. I mean, you look at the name Steve Wilkes, right? Like, Wilkes went from hotshot DC to laughable head coach to fired again in 1 year in Cleveland. And now, it sounds like he'll resurface in Washington if the Redskins hire Ron Rivera, but and Chuck Pagano is another guy. Romeo Crennel, all these different guys that they get a shot to be head coach and then they fail, and then typically then they're just reset as defense coordinators for life. And so that's the thing, is Vance is going to have a chance to kind of sit and regroup, because he's probably not going to get a head coaching job again for at least another decade, unless the Cardinals defense is just top 5 in the NFL for the next 3 years. But you even look at Seattle. I mean, a lot of times it has more to do with the personnel than the scheme. And we, look no further than Seattle. You've got a team that was built on a physical, fast defense, and now they're a laughable defense at this point. They create a lot of turnovers, but they don't really do a whole lot else. And so when you look at it, and then you look at a team like the 49ers, I mean, they went from an amazing defense to being really, really bad, back to being a really good defense again. So it comes in waves, unless you're just an awful organization. And so that's the whole thing, is Vance is going to have a chance to kind of build this up. And like I said, you look at it from the Kingsbury perspective. Okay, everybody's going to say Kingsbury's first season was a success. And I think you and I both would agree with that because of what he was tasked to do: fix a broken offense. They went from one of the historically worst offenses in the NFL to very middling. That's fine. You're in that 16 to 20 range on offense. That's a huge jump. I don't think people understand how much of a jump that is. And so now you do kind of – now I understand Vance is part of the reason why they're one of the, 3 worst defenses in the NFL. But at the same token, if now all of a sudden they're just one of the 12 or, 13 worst defenses in the NFL in his second year, okay, now you're trending in the right direction, and then you're expecting to be a top 15 defense in year 3, and then maybe, year 4 – you're expecting to be, a Super Bowl contending team that has a top, like you said, a top 12 defense and a top 5 offense type thing.
Cut on next door of the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We're going to move on and talk about actually a couple of changes that have been made to the coaching staff. That's coming on next on the Rise Up Sea Red. We're back on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. And while Vance Joseph is staying, not all of the coaching staff is. The first 2 names to be out are reportedly Chris Acuff, defensive line coach, and assistant special teams coach Randall McRae. Both were holdovers from the Steve Wilkes staff. Do you see any impact? Like, what are your thoughts? I mean, when it comes to position coaches, you look at the defensive line the last couple of years, you can't blame them much from the injuries this year. But the defensive line has been a big weakness each of the last 2 years. So I get it. Is changing out either of these 2 guys going to be making any sort of real impact?
I think Acuff got a bad hand dealt to him. I don't really know what the other dude did. I know what his title was, but I don't really know what he did to deserve to be fired, if that's fair. So my biggest thing is obviously Acuff. Again, it's a defensive line coach. We all love Brinson Buckner, but it wasn't like they got better under him consistently either. So, if it's a Vance call or if it's a Cliff call, I'm on board with it. If it's a Steve Keim call, I have more questions, if that's fair.
Right.
So I think that's how I look at it.
This is completely normal. These are guys that this is completely normal. When you have holdovers from a previous coaching staff and they stay over, it's usually within a year or 2 they're gone. It's usually the case.
Right.
So especially with Acuff, it's probably a case where either Vance or Cliff have a guy that they wanted a year ago but couldn't get for whatever reason. And maybe
that's all that
there was a mandate. Maybe there was a mandate from Keim a year ago to maintain X number of coaches on the staff from the previous group.
And that's probably true. Were they fired or were their contracts not renewed? Because most of those guys just get 2-year deals, right?
I don't know. 1 to 2 years seems to be kind of the norm. Yeah.
So you just wonder if that's what it comes down to. In essence, they were fired because their contract wasn't renewed, but it wasn't that they were fired.
Or maybe
you get what I'm
they
saying?
Terminated them a week before their contract was up. Therefore, they are technically fired.
Right. Yeah. So, you're playing a semantics game where you were just not going to bring back a guy anyways. And so now you've got the first line of defense type thing.
Do you anticipate seeing more of these? Now, I kind of went over that when I wrote about the report, because it hasn't been announced. Cliff wouldn't talk about that in his presser this morning, on Monday morning. They've got 7 holdovers They had 7 holdovers from Wilkes, and a couple of them were actually back from Arians. So they're Buddy Morris, their strength and conditioning coach, he's held over from Arians, in fact, the last couple of years. You've got Cam Turner on offense. He's an assistant quarterbacks coach and offensive assistant. You got the tight ends coach, Steve Hayden, although I don't anticipate Hayden leaving because he and Sean Kugler were kind of the run game gurus. And Cliff has mentioned Hayden many times this season for the success of the running game. So I don't see Hayden, but Cam Turner possibly. You've got Vernon Stevens, who's an assistant strength and conditioning. I got Buddy Norris, who's got strength and conditioning. So would it surprise you to see any of these other guys be let go?
Depends on, again, their Cliff Vance kind of thing. I mean, if we're still believing this is a two-pronged approach where Vance is kind of the head coach of the defense, then I could see any non-Vance disciples or guys that Vance brought in that he wants a fresh set of eyes or a fresh start from going. Same with Cliff. I mean, if Cliff is making the calls on this, then that's one thing. But I look at it as you would have thought it would have happened already, right? Like, why just do 2 and not do whoever else, unless there are some like conversations going on in the background that are maybe in a way of kind of trying to fight or find out where everybody stands heading into the next season type thing.
Well, and the Alex Marvez report said he suggested that other changes were coming. I don't see them being big changes. I mean, Brian Rogers. Brian Rogers, the other holdover, and Cliff fell in love with the guy in terms of his coaching, and he gave him the assistant head coach title. So Brian Rogers isn't going anywhere. Vance Joseph is not going anywhere. David Rye is a name to watch, not because of let's say they would fire him. He's a guy that maybe you see rise up coaching the coaching ranks throughout the league. He's a guy that seems to be on the rise, at least in my opinion. Seems to be a guy that's going to be on the rise, kind of in that, especially if Cliff has with a successful year, Rye would be a guy that they would pluck off his staff because he's kind of the same mindset.
And then, I mean, you've got Jerry Sullivan. Like, are they going to not bring him back, right? And I don't even know what his title is. Is he mentor to the wide receiver?
Offensive consultant, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and Tom Clement. I mean, those would be the bigger names, right? Maybe guys that are retiring.
Yeah.
Close to retirement.
That definitely could happen. But, I mean, none of those, I don't think they're... Even Scott Bordeaux. There was a name that Scott Bordeaux from The Athletic threw out there as a guy to watch. He's the defensive line coach for the San Francisco 49ers is a name to watch because he worked with Cliff at Texas Tech. That'd be an interesting name to pay attention to. Maybe want to take a look at some of Vance Joseph staffs in Denver to see what the possibility is of a defensive line guy coming over. But with that, let's move on. And coming up next on the Rise to See Red podcast, we're going to start with our awards. This is going to be the part of our award show. This next segment will be the more obvious ones. The MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year, that sort of thing. That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. But let's talk about some awards. So these are the awards that we're going to give out. MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year, Most Improved, and Comeback Player of the Year. Would you say, would it be, could you really say that the offensive MVP was anyone other than Mr. K1 himself, Kyler Murray?
No, and that's the thing. I think the reality becomes this offense there was only two guys that could really win it, and one of them was only here for half the season. Obviously Kenyon Drake. And so maybe if Drake was here for a whole season, I mean, he was on pace for a really nice full season through Arizona. So, I mean, maybe you can make a case for that, especially since he played a big part in them winning, 2 extra games this year. But I think it's pretty safe to say it was Kyler.
That's kind of the obvious one. And the truth is, for Offensive Player of the Year, I instead of giving it to Kyler, he probably gets. I'm giving it to Kenyon Drake because of his impact late in the year, because of how his emergence truly transformed the offense.
Well, and the crazy thing is, like, if you just put obviously he played 8 games, so if you just put his numbers into the 16 game span, and remember, he didn't get to play against New York, he didn't get to play early against Seattle, and then he missed, obviously, who else? Detroit.
Well,
Detroit,
the 3 wins, and so against those Atlanta, Cincinnati, New York.
Cincinnati, thank you.
Atlanta, Cincinnati, New York, the bad defenses.
Right. So, I mean, he did that. He put up 643 yards against some good defenses. Obviously, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, Tampa had the number 1 ranked rush defense in the NFL. So, I mean, to see him have just under 1,300 yards and 16 touchdowns, that's his pace. Whew, that's insane.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And then obviously Defensive Player of the Year. That one.
Can you just pick Patrick Peterson for 2 games? No, I mean, yeah. Again, it's the same thing.
It's Chandler Jones. I mean, come on. This is the guy that probably he probably not getting to 20 sacks. He probably isn't going to be Defensive Player of the Year. He's in that conversation, but there is no doubt that he is the Defensive Player of the Year for the Cardinals. Come on. Another record, 19 sacks, 8 forced fumbles. He has been the driving force of that defense, and he's been doing it pretty much on his own.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing, is that there's just not a ton of talent. And so to be the guy that is, like you said, the driving force, to be the guy is the singular pass rushing force on this team, like, that's crazy. And by the way,
here's the part that's even more amazing that Vance Joseph revealed last week, is that he now is playing the rush linebacker guy, where we've seen him drop into coverage. Now, it's not like he did it a ton, but Vance said it's probably been up until after Suggs was released. Suggs didn't ever drop because that would be a terrible idea. But Chandler dropped about 40, 45 times in the first 13 games of the season. And he said if he's rushing the quarterback in those plays instead, it's 1 or 2 more sacks. So you're looking at 20 to 21 sacks. And then you legitimately would have had a chance at that all-time record by Michael Strahan at 22.5. But he's putting up his numbers, and he said, Vance Joseph, is that the drop linebacker typically does not lead the team in sacks. And he leads the team by the sacks by a lot.
Well, and again, it goes back to that article that Walter wrote, where there was just obviously a disconnect. I mean, why would you sign Terrell Suggs to be your rush linebacker? Like, no offense to Suggs, but I mean, at best, he's going to give you 70% of Chandler Jones. Now, 70% of 19 is a lot, so let's be honest. But if he has a normal season, at best, he's going to give you, 8 sacks when Chandler's getting you 12. And so you're giving up an extra 3 to 4 sacks from Chandler to acquiesce a guy that, again, is 70% of the player he is at this stage in his career. Jones is crazy because you think about it. You look at the history of the Cardinals. Freddie Joe Nunn leads the team in sacks. Obviously, sacks didn't come into play until the 80s, I believe it was. 82, I want to say. Might have been 81. But nonetheless, Freddie Joe Nunn leads the team. He played for 131 games, so basically 9 seasons, 66 and a half. Jones is now 2 after his 4th season in Arizona. He's only played 64 games. So 64 games, 60 sacks. That's incredible. Calais Campbell's 3 with 56 and a half sacks in 138 games. Now there's conversations to be had about how Campbell was used for the 9 years he was here, but still. And then Simeon Rice, same kind of trajectory that Chandler's on, but he's not even as good. That's the craziest thing. I mean, Simeon Rice in 5 seasons with the Cardinals had 51 and a half sacks, and Chandler Jones, again, 4 seasons, has already beat that. Like, that's been a godsend. It's incredible to see. Hopefully now the Cardinals can help him and put some talent around him so they can start getting some wins.
Now, these two are interesting. For you, who is the most improved player over last season?
That's tough because when you look at most improved, it can go a couple of different ways. I think, obviously, Justin Pugh being available and playing a bunch is improvement. However, for me, and people may disagree with me, and that's fine, you can be wrong, but I think it's Budda Baker. Budda went from a guy that was kind of trying to find a position in a home to being a completely dominant force on the defense, and to see him grow into a role where he's one of the better safeties in the NFL was impressive to me, because I was starting to worry about kind of his career trajectory, not of any of his own doing, but just because it never seemed like he got a chance to play where he was best at. And so to see him, finally get a chance to play the position that he's best at, and then obviously to do it in just such a high, at a high level, it was good to see.
For me, like, Budda's a great pick. I'm going to go with 2 guys that were kind of afterthoughts, who then were playing important roles down the stretch. One would be Joe Walker at linebacker, and the other would be Damiere Byrd at receiver. The Byrd signing was really sort of out of the blue. Like, no one cared about it. When the announcement was like, "Who's that guy?" Oh, okay. And he didn't put up massive numbers because there was a month, like, he didn't really even play in the month of November, but he's had, I think, 3 or 4 of the best receiving games of the season for the Cardinals. And then Joe Walker, he is a limited player, but the production at linebacker improved with his insertion to the starting lineup over Hassan Reddick. And here's the thing. He started games before, but he was never anything more than a special teams player. And while we might argue that's probably the role he should have, he showed he can play linebacker. He'd be a linebacker. He'd be a starting linebacker on a not very good defense, but he deserves to be in the league, and he can play.
Yeah, and so that's the big thing, is to continue to watch these guys grow and change who they are. It was interesting that Walker got the nod over a guy like Ezekiel Turner, who was in-house already. I mean, I know Walker was here too, but, like, to see Walker get the nod over guys like Turner, obviously, to basically earn the starting position over Hassan Reddick, to see all of that happen, I think it was, that's a good pick. Bird's one of those guys that nobody really expected anything, and you and I have talked about this. If he's your 4-5 receiver, you're in a really good spot. The fact that he was kind of their de facto 2-3 for most of the season was kind of why this team, from a receiving aspect, that's why Jess and I will bang the drum for a receiver, just because of that situation.
And for you, who is your comeback player for this year?
I would probably give it to AQ Shipley. Obviously, he didn't play last year. He earned the starting position over Mason Cole, and then just kind of, he's never going to be a spectacular guy, but when he's your anchor in the middle, it's not a bad thing.
And me, I'm going to give it to DJ Humphries. Yeah, he got the penalties, but he proved that he could play an entire season and play at a high level. The analytics, the Pro Football Focus grades aren't great, but you can tell in-house and what he says, they know, because he's the left tackle for one of the best rushing attacks in the game. On a team that gave up a crap ton of sacks, he gave up 2 all year. The penalties are something to work on, but you also look at across the board some of the names out there for the leaders in penalties. Tyron Smith's up there, Laramie Tunsil, both of which are considered 2 of the very talented of left tackles in football. So knowing that, the fact that he's had the injuries that he's had, never been able to finish, I would give my comeback player of the year to DJ Humphries, and it's going to pay off handsomely for him in this offseason.
Oh, yeah, he's going to get paid.
With that, coming up next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, we've got a few other awards, or sort of, not necessarily awards, but superlatives. The superlatives are coming up next on Rise of C-Red. We're back on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. It's time for the superlatives. Okay, biggest surprise of the season, the best non-rookie addition, and the biggest. Well, we'll talk about the biggest surprise. Let's start with, other than the rookies, who was the best addition to the team this season?
That's tough. I would probably say, obviously skipping Cliff Kingsbury and Kyler Murray, I would say Jordan Hicks. Max Williams would be a sneaky second, but I think Hicks, for all of his flaws and faults, he steadied the inside linebacking core like it hasn't been in the last couple of years. Now, it's still not a good group, but it made it palatable when it hadn't been.
That's kind of my top choice. Is the best addition? Max Williams is a good one, but I'm gonna give mine to J.R. Sweezy. J.R. Sweezy, he's been steady all year. A guy that was considered a really kind of a below average lineman, has been his addition up the nasty on that line. Justin Pugh, I don't think has ever been viewed as a nasty player. DJ Humphries got some nasty. AQ Shipley's got fight, but I don't know if you could call him nasty. Jared Sweezy brings that nasty to the game, and that interior, adding him to that interior with Shipley coming back, and then Pugh going to a more natural position, you really anchored that middle, and J.R. Sweezy's addition became real important to me.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair one, because you kind of look at what this team lacked last year. Obviously, health was one of the big things, but they lacked that nasty factor that you talked about. And Shipley and Sweezy kind of oozed that. That's kind of that is who they are as players. So to see that from them, I thought that's why they're important.
Now, the biggest surprises. What were the biggest of these? I'm talking positives, because we're going to talk about what was. I think we could probably put some surprises as disappointments as well. Well, let's think of surprises as positive things. What were the biggest surprises on this team?
I mean, the first thing is how good the running game was. We talked about it a lot, so I won't go into detail, but we talked about that a lot. Just a timestamp for you. The fact that they are the second best rushing team in the NFL, according to DVOA, is just insane to me. I mean, they've never, I don't think in the history of Arizona, averaged as a team over 5 yards per carry. That's crazy.
For me, one of the biggest surprises was the so-called injury-prone players they had on the team were durable. Now, they lost Robert Alford. He wasn't viewed as an injury-prone player. He was an older player who had injuries last year. But if you look at the guys, with the exception of Marcus Gilbert, they got bit with that bit them. But Justin Pugh, DJ Humphries, Jordan Hicks, all of whom had the fragile label, played all 16 games. Jordan Hicks played more snaps than any other defensive player in the entire league. DJ Humphries, I think, missed 4 snaps on the season. Justin Pugh started all 16 games for the first time since he was a rookie. Now, he didn't play as many snaps, and it wasn't because he got injured. I don't know if he left a game with an injury. I think the only time he came out was just to give Mason Cole playing time because Cliff Kingsbury thinks that highly of Mason Cole. And so for me, the biggest surprise was the offensive line stayed healthy, and that because the Cardinals have been bit in particular because they've gone with the high reward, high risk player who's, if they turn it around, can be super productive, but they've got a history of injuries. And the guys with histories of injuries in recent years have tended to get hurt. And this year, that offensive line was incredibly durable.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point and shows kind of why they were successful this year. I think the other big surprise was how, and this is probably it's definitely a negative, but it's probably a negative, but how let's just say 2, because I don't know how much we counted on Terrell Suggs, but to see David Johnson and DJ Swearinger both be basically non-factors in this season. I mean, DJ had the touchdown in the Lions game to help them get to a tie, but for them to be a net 0 on the season, that's crazy to think about when you go into the season. I mean, you would assume that they were probably a 2 or 3 win team if that's the case.
For me, another good big surprise. 2 of them. One, who would have thought that their supplemental 5th round pick would have been one of their more impactful defensive players, or one of their more impactful rookies this year? Jalen Thompson. And let's say Seth and I gushed about the talent of Deontay Thompson. It's Jalen Thompson, the guy that when they drafted him, we looked at the numbers, we looked at the fact that he kind of had a knucklehead move with the banned substance, and then you look at the very underwhelming, they weren't overwhelming physical traits. He looks like he's showing flashes of being potentially special.
Yeah, and that's a big deal for them because they need that talent along the secondary, and for it to be young. And if you can have a core of Jalen, Buddha, and Byron, and obviously Patrick is kind of your veteran that you stick with for the next couple of years, man, that could be a really talented secondary where you're maybe just need one guy instead of 2 or 3 guys.
And obviously Kenyon Drake, oh my gosh, what a surprise. A guy that really never had the opportunity, but the way he burst onto the scene here. Now, he had 3 just absolutely special games. He had a good game against the Rams in the second half. then he had some okay games. But we said the projections. He projected for 1,300 yards if he was doing this through a whole season, and the Cardinals might be looking at him as their number one back in free agency this year. So I don't think anyone could have predicted the sort of impact that Drake was going to have, and the fact that his play rendered David Johnson completely unneeded on a team where David Johnson was supposed to be the focal point of this offense.
Yeah, and that's I think you hit it on the head. Shocking, surprising, any of the above. You look at it, and that's a great get by Steve Keim for a 5th-round pick that probably won't be on the roster. And I know Jalen Thompson was a 5th-round pick, but still, most 5th-round picks don't end up on the roster.
You're right. We look at Deontay Thompson, who's a 5th-round pick this year, and he's been inactive for the last month and a half. This, unfortunately, at a 5-10-1 season, the biggest disappointment. There are a lot of these. Let's be honest. There's a lot of these. I mean, the fact that Hassan Reddick never couldn't do it. Now, there's a little bit of hope for him at the outside linebacker position, but once again, he disappointed at inside linebacker. Robert Kimdichie and Darius Philon in training camp. David Johnson, what in the world has happened to him? It's inexplicable.
I mean, you and I have hypothesized. I think some of it's he's gone David Boston. He's just gotten a little too big and muscular, and it's caused some tightness in his hips that he's just not as athletic and explosive as he once was. But, I mean, I think the bigger thing is he doesn't seem – and I hate questioning guys' drive, but he just doesn't seem like he is a guy that is engaged.
He's not as a football player, you have to be a little bit reckless with your body. He's lost that reckless.
Yeah, definitely, and I think that's a huge deal.
Patrick Peterson's play outside of December can be seen as nothing short of an absolute disappointment. Between the suspension and his play is really the Cardinals had a lot of disappointments. I mean, between Robert Kimdichie, David Johnson, DJ Swearinger, Terrell Suggs, Darius Philon, and then you add
Reddick,
to that,
as you said,
that Patrick Peterson's play. It's amazing after having as bad a season in 2018 as they did, that 2019 could have that many disappointments, and yet you feel so good about the team moving forward, right?
You just feel like they're heading in the right direction, and that's a big deal. I mean, when you look at it from that perspective, it's a big deal to feel like the team is heading in the right direction and going to be successful, because that's not how we felt coming out of last year.
You know who I was just thinking, you know what newcomer that we completely overlooked? Oh, he's not technically a newcomer, never mind. Zane Gonzalez, but no, they had him last year, so he doesn't count. But what an addition he was. You don't have to worry about the kicking position anymore, and that's something that is not a disappointment. There's a go. Zane Gonzalez was not a disappointment. He was a surprise as well, because we thought there was no reason in the world why the Cardinals would not bring in competition, but they didn't bring in competition. Then he got shaky, but he's been so good this year. But that's moving backwards. In terms of disappointments, can you think of anything else? I mean, other than the defense as a whole, but in terms of players and situations, I mean, that's a lot of disappointment to still have a kind of a positive thing moving forward.
Yeah, and that's the thing is there are several disappointing factors. I think the lack of growth from the wide receiving core was outside of Demir Bird was disappointing, especially Andy Isabella and Keyshawn Johnson. Hakeem Butler getting injured was disappointing, but not something you can call a disappointment in the season. Christian Kirk maybe not taking that next step yet. I think all of those things were disappointing, but overall you feel like, again, that they're headed in the right direction and that you see the vision moving forward. And that's something that we didn't say last year because, well, by this time Steve Wilkes had been fired.
And then we were hot and heavy into who's going to be the coach. Oh, it's going to be Cliff Kingsbury. Oh, Kyler Murray. This offseason is going to be very, very different. That's going to wrap up this edition of the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We will wrap up episode 254. Probably, I think we will be back on a regular show next week to start our off-season shows, and we'll begin to talk about team needs and things of that nature moving forwards. On behalf of this edition of the Rise of C-Red podcast, that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening. Go Cardinals, and hey, we'll be back again next week.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise Up Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise Up C-Red.